What if hundreds of years of history never happened? Imagine waking up tomorrow and learning that the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries were nothing but a medieval invention. This chilling possibility is at the heart of the phantom time hypothesis, a radical theory proposed in 1991. It doesn't just challenge one event, it questions our entire timeline. Could kings, battles, and empires we've studied simply be illusions? Could the calendar itself be lying to us? The phantom time hypothesis dares to ask, what if the year we live in is a historical fraud? The man behind this unsettling claim was Heribert Illig, a German historian who loved to dig into the inconsistencies of medieval records. In 1991, he shocked the academic world by declaring that nearly 3 centuries, from 614 to 911 AD, never actually happened. According to Illig, our current year is wrong by almost 300 years. Instead of the 21st century, he argued humanity should be living in the 1700s. To many, it sounded absurd, but Illig was convinced that the historical record was riddled with contradictions too big to ignore. Illig named these missing years the Phantom Centuries. He argued that from 614 to 911 AD, Europe showed suspicious silence. Few monuments, almost no new technology, and little cultural growth could be traced to those years. Entire generations seemed absent from the record. To Illig, this silence was not a coincidence. It was the result of a fabricated timeline inserted into history for political and religious reasons. If he was right, then the Middle Ages were shorter than we thought, and whole chapters of our textbooks might be nothing but fiction. Who could possibly alter the flow of time itself? Illig accused Emperor Otto III of the Holy Roman Empire and Pope Sylvester II. According to him, these powerful figures wanted to rewrite history so that they could live in a symbolic year 1000 AD. To medieval minds, that number carried apocalyptic and divine meaning. By pushing the calendar forward, Otto could claim a more glorious reign, and the Pope could claim prophetic authority. It was, Illig said, a manipulation of time designed to serve the vanity and ambition of rulers. The boldest part of Illig's theory was his claim that Charlemagne, one of Europe's greatest rulers, might never have existed. The emperor celebrated as the father of Europe could be nothing more than a fabrication. Illig pointed out that the chronicles of Charlemagne's reign were inconsistent, copied centuries later, and possibly forged. If Charlemagne was invented, then the foundations of the Holy Roman Empire were built on lies. Such an idea was unthinkable to historians, but it captured the public's imagination. Could Europe's most legendary emperor have been nothing but a phantom? Architecture became one of Illig's strongest arguments. Between 600 and 900 AD, Europe seemed frozen in time. Few cathedrals rose, castles were rare, and innovations almost vanished. In earlier and later centuries, history left behind countless buildings. But in these phantom centuries, there was little stone to speak of. Illig argued that this architectural silence revealed an invented past. If no one built, perhaps no one lived. His critics countered that wars and plagues could explain the slowdown, but Illig insisted the absence of construction was a sign that the centuries never existed at all. Illig also turned to the calendar. When Pope Gregory XIII reformed the Julian calendar in 1582, 10 days were skipped to correct centuries of drift. But to Illig, the adjustment was too small. If 600 years had truly passed since Julius Caesar introduced his calendar, more days should have been corrected. The smaller correction made sense only if fewer centuries had gone by, exactly as Illig claimed. To him, the phantom time hypothesis explained why the calendar aligned better with reality than historians expected. For skeptics, it was a coincidence. For Illig, proof of fraud. If Illig's hypothesis were true, then we are not in the year 2025, but closer to 1728. This revelation would shake every timeline we rely on: dynasties, inventions, battles, and religious milestones. It would mean humanity lives in a grand illusion, trapped in centuries that never were. Imagine the Renaissance arriving too early, or the medieval church ruling in a fabricated vacuum. History, as we know it, would collapse like a house of cards. Illig insisted that the truth lay hidden in plain sight, waiting for the brave to question time itself. The phantom time hypothesis is more than a historical curiosity. It challenges our trust in memory, documents, and authority. If 3 centuries could be forged, what else in history is false? How much of the past is propaganda, rewritten by rulers to serve their image? Illig's idea forces us to face uncomfortable questions. Do we know history, or only what we are told? And if time itself can be rewritten, then perhaps the boundaries between fact and fiction are far thinner than we dare to admit. That fear fuels both doubt and fascination. This is only the beginning of the phantom time mystery. In the next part, we will dive deeper into the so-called evidence, strange gaps in medieval records, astronomical anomalies, and contradictions that seem to support Illig's bold claim. But we will also see why most historians dismiss this hypothesis as fantasy. Between mystery and fact lies a battlefield of ideas, and you must decide which side to believe. The phantom time hypothesis dares us to look at history not as settled truth, but as a story still under debate. When Illig examined medieval chronicles, he noticed strange gaps. Whole decades had little to no documentation. Wars, rulers, and events were vaguely described or written centuries later. In some cases, the same story seemed to repeat under different names. This echoing of history made him wonder if scribes had copied and recycled material to fill invented time. Where we expected detail, there was silence. And where we expected diversity, there were suspicious patterns. Illig believed these gaps and repetitions were not accidents. They were signs of a timeline being artificially stretched. Illig turned to the sky for evidence. Astronomy, after all, does not lie. Ancient sources describe eclipses, comets, and planetary alignments. But when matched to modern calculations, some events did not fit the supposed timeline. Illig claimed that medieval records of eclipses were misplaced by centuries, proving the calendar had been tampered with. If the stars didn't align with history, then perhaps history was wrong. Critics argued that scribes often misdated celestial events, but Illig insisted these errors were too consistent to be chance. They were the fingerprints of a forged chronology. To Illig, the empire of Charlemagne was suspiciously perfect. The records made him seem larger than life, a warrior, scholar, and unifier of Europe all at once. Yet evidence of his reign, from coins to documents, seemed inconsistent. Some historians already suspected exaggeration, but Illig took it further. What if Charlemagne was invented to fill phantom centuries? An emperor, too, ideal to be real, could have been a convenient myth, designed to give Europe a heroic past. This claim outraged scholars, but fascinated the public. Could Europe's greatest emperor be just a shadow? Archaeology should confirm the past, yet Illig argued it often failed to. From 600 to 900 AD, the material records seemed thin. Few new styles of pottery, scarce architectural remains, and limited inscriptions marked the centuries. Later artifacts suddenly reappeared with more complexity, as if civilization had leapt forward overnight. To Illig, this was evidence of missing time. Where were the tools, the graves, the everyday objects of 3 centuries of life? Their absence echoed louder than words. For him, archaeology whispered that those years were not lived, but later imagined. Coins are powerful witnesses of history. They carry faces of rulers, dates, and symbols of power. Yet between 600 and 900 AD, coins were surprisingly few. When they did appear, their designs often looked recycled from earlier periods. Illig suggested this scarcity revealed a manufactured past. If rulers truly reigned during those centuries, why weren't their faces stamped into copper and silver? Economies run on coinage, but the coins of the phantom centuries seemed almost invisible. For Illig, this absence was another crack in the foundation of accepted history. Illig also noticed that some medieval events mirrored earlier ones almost exactly. Battles, treaties, and rulers seemed to echo the past with only names changed. To him, this was not coincidence, but recycling. Chroniclers, short on material, may have copied older stories to fill invented years. The pattern was too neat, victories and defeats replayed like theater. If history felt repetitive, it was because, Illig argued, parts of it were. Time had been doubled, leaving us with an illusion of centuries that were little more than copies of the past. History usually moves with invention, new tools, new art, new ideas. Yet Illig argued that between 600 and 900 AD, Europe seemed strangely stagnant. Few breakthroughs in science or culture marked the era. Then, suddenly, innovation surged again after 900. To Illig, this pause in human creativity was suspicious. How could nearly 300 years pass without invention, then burst alive again? For him, the simplest answer was that those centuries never happened. Critics pointed to war and disease as explanations, but Illig insisted, humanity does not stay still for centuries. Illig knew his theory sounded outrageous, but he believed he was uncovering the greatest historical fraud ever committed. He compared himself to Galileo, mocked at first but later vindicated. To Illig, resistance from historians only proved how afraid they were of questioning tradition. He published books, gave lectures, and debated critics with relentless passion. His claim wasn't modest. It suggested that nearly 30% of early medieval history was a fabrication. He wanted the world to doubt its own calendar and see history not as truth, but as a story carefully edited. The public, unlike scholars, found Illig's idea fascinating. Newspapers covered the story with dramatic headlines. 300 years of history never happened. Readers debated whether they had been living in a grand illusion. To many, it explained why medieval history felt confusing and full of contradictions. The phantom time hypothesis gave ordinary people a chance to challenge experts and imagine hidden truths. It was thrilling to think that the calendar itself might be a lie. For Illig's audience, this was not dry history. It was a mystery novel come to life. By the mid-1990s, Illig's phantom time hypothesis was a heated debate. Historians dismissed it as nonsense, but conspiracy theorists embraced it. Radio shows, magazines, and later the internet spread the idea worldwide. Some demanded re-examination of medieval records, while others mocked the theory as fantasy. Illig's claim had divided history into two camps: those who believed in a phantom past, and those who saw only sloppy scholarship. Regardless of truth, the theory forced people to ask, how solid is the ground we call history? And can time itself ever be trusted? Uncovered artifacts clearly dated to the so-called phantom centuries. From burial sites to inscriptions, the record was not empty. Historians insisted that Illig's missing centuries were visible in pottery styles, coin hoards, and even tree rings. To them, Illig's theory was built on selective blindness, seeing only silence where there was plenty of noise. One of the strongest rebuttals came from dendrochronology, the science of tree rings. By studying the growth rings in ancient timbers, scientists had built a year-by-year record stretching back thousands of years. These tree rings aligned perfectly with historical dates, including the so-called phantom centuries. If those years were invented, the trees hadn't gotten the message. Their silent growth proved that time had passed as expected. Illig's critics saw this as the ultimate refutation. Nature itself kept better time than human scribes ever could. Astronomers also pushed back. Yes, medieval scribes sometimes misdated eclipses, but many celestial events lined up perfectly with the traditional timeline. Comets described in Chinese, Arab, and European sources matched modern astronomical calculations. These independent records, across continents, would all need to be wrong for Illig to be right. Critics argued that it was impossible for Chinese astronomers and Arab scholars to have joined a Western conspiracy. The stars, after all, shine the same for everyone. Illig's celestial anomalies, they said, were simply human errors, not proof of phantom time. Historians pointed out that thousands of documents survive from the phantom centuries: charters, letters, laws, and contracts. These were not grand chronicles, but everyday records of life. Farmers leasing land, nobles granting rights, monks copying texts, all dated between 614 and 911 AD. If those years never existed, why do so many small, mundane documents bear their marks? For scholars, the sheer weight of paperwork made Illig's theory collapse. Inventing one emperor might be possible. Inventing 3 centuries of daily business was beyond imagination. The Byzantine Empire, stretching across the eastern Mediterranean, left behind a rich record of the so-called phantom centuries. Coins of emperors, mosaics in churches, and diplomatic treaties all pointed to continuous history. If Europe had invented centuries, Byzantium would also need to fake its past, an unlikely collaboration. The empire's detailed annals, preserved in Greek, recorded wars and rulers that fit neatly into the disputed period. For historians, Byzantium's existence during these years was undeniable, and it alone destroyed the core of Illig's claim. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, the so-called phantom centuries were a golden age. From Baghdad to Cordoba, scholars advanced mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Their works survive with clear dates, spreading knowledge later into medieval Europe. To erase 300 years would mean erasing the very foundations of algebra, optics, and medical science. Illig's critics argued that Islamic scholars could not have invented centuries of progress just to match a Western conspiracy. Their brilliance was real, and its legacy lived on in books, observatories, and libraries that still stand today. Far from Europe, Chinese dynasties also recorded the centuries Illig erased. Their court chronicles noted eclipses, famines, and political shifts with meticulous detail. These events matched global astronomical data and overlapped with Arab and Byzantine sources. For Illig to be correct, Chinese historians, isolated by geography, would need to join the conspiracy. This was implausible. To scholars, the fact that civilizations across the globe independently recorded the same centuries proved their reality. The phantom time hypothesis, they argued, ignored a simple truth. History is bigger than Europe. By the late 1990s, historians considered the phantom time hypothesis demolished by evidence. Archaeology, astronomy, and cross-cultural records all contradicted Illig's claims. Yet the theory refused. 2D. It survived not because of facts, but because of fascination. People loved the idea that history itself might be a fraud. It appealed to those who mistrusted authority, who wanted to believe that hidden truths lay behind official stories. For many, Illig's failure in academia only made him more appealing. The weight of evidence crushed his claims, but curiosity kept them alive. Why, then, does the phantom time hypothesis remain popular? Psychologists suggest it taps into our natural suspicion of authority. People like to think they know secrets the experts hide. The theory also offers a thrilling narrative, a grand conspiracy stretching across centuries, fooling the entire world. It makes ordinary history feel alive, dangerous, and mysterious. In a way, itself could be questioned, whether believed or mocked. The phantom time hypothesis had entered cultural memory. It was more than history. It was a mirror reflecting our doubts about truth. In the next part, we will explore how the theory spread into media, how it fueled endless debates online, and why, despite evidence, it refuses to fade away. Hobbyists and conspiracy enthusiasts worldwide. Online communities thrived on questioning authority, and phantom time became a perfect example. The web amplified both the ridicule and the fascination. Historians dismissed it with digital essays, while believers shared memes about living in the real year 1727. The internet transformed Illig's niche theory into a cultural curiosity. The theory even crept into pop culture. TV shows, documentaries, and novels mention phantom centuries as eerie, what-if scenarios. Some authors used it as a backdrop for alternate history stories. For audiences, the idea that Charlemagne might be fictional or that the year 1000 was invented felt like fertile ground for imagination. The hypothesis blurred lines between fact and fiction, turning history into entertainment. Though rarely taken seriously by experts, its very absurdity made it memorable. The Phantom Time hypothesis became a story people loved to retell at parties. Be left unquestioned. He portrayed himself as a lone truth seeker standing against institutions unwilling to rethink the past. While mainstream historians grew tired of debating him, Illig maintained a loyal following who admired his courage to challenge orthodoxy. His legacy was not rewriting history, but reminding people that even sacred timelines could be questioned. Heribert Illig continued to defend his theory through books and lectures, but as years passed, academic rejection wore heavy. Still, he never admitted defeat. To Illig, history was too important to be left unquestioned. He portrayed himself as a lone truth seeker standing against institutions unwilling to rethink the past. While mainstream historians grew tired of debating him, Illig maintained a loyal following who admired his courage to challenge orthodoxy. His legacy was not rewriting history, but reminding people that even sacred timelines could be questioned. Whether true or false, the Phantom Time hypothesis teaches a valuable lesson. History is fragile. It depends on documents, artifacts, and interpretations that can be incomplete or biased. While Illig may have been wrong, his critics admitted that history often carries gaps and uncertainties. The debate highlighted how much we rely on trust in scribes, scientists, and institutions. The theory was less about missing centuries than about human confidence. Could we be wrong about the past? The uncomfortable answer is yes, at least in part. The Phantom Time hypothesis is part of a broader pattern. People love conspiracies. They make the world feel more dramatic, more dangerous, and more exciting. Believing in hidden truths gives a sense of control in a confusing universe. Just as some believe in lost civilizations or hidden aliens, others believe centuries of history were invented. These stories thrive because they appeal to emotion. Decades after its birth, the Phantom Time hypothesis refuses to vanish. Each generation rediscovers it, asking again, could history itself be fake? The answer is almost certainly no, but the question is irresistible, even as historians pile evidence against it. The mystery lives on because it touches something deeper, our fear that the past is unknowable and our future rests on fragile ground. In that sense, Phantom Time is less about missing centuries than about human anxiety. The theory lingers not as science, but as folklore for the skeptical age. Still, most scholars reassure us, the centuries Illig erased did exist. From Byzantine mosaics to Islamic libraries and Chinese annals, the record is too vast to dismiss. Archaeology continues to uncover graves, weapons, and everyday objects from those years. Nature itself, through tree rings and ice cores, proves time has flowed continuously. The Phantom Time hypothesis may intrigue, but the real evidence secures the past. Our timeline, while imperfect, is not fiction. Humanity did live through the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, though perhaps less dramatically than legends suggest. So why should we care about a disproven theory? Because it reminds us to think critically. Illig's claim, though flawed, forced scholars to re-examine evidence and explain why history is reliable. It sparked public interest in medieval studies, astronomy, and archaeology. Most importantly, it showed that even wild ideas can keep knowledge alive in public debate. The Phantom Time hypothesis matters not because it is true, but because it challenges us to ask questions. And questions, even misguided ones, are the heartbeat of discovery. In the end, the Phantom Time hypothesis is less a theory than a story about power, vanity, and our fragile grip on truth. It shows how easily history can be bent, misunderstood, or even imagined. Whether you believe Illig or not, you will remember his daring question: what if centuries never happened? That haunting thought sticks even after the facts are explained. The story remains in classrooms, libraries, and late-night conversations. Because sometimes the wildest ideas are the ones that live the longest. And so we return to the question, what if 300 years never existed? The evidence says they did. Yet the fascination lingers, because doubt is part of being human. The phantom time hypothesis may be false, but it reveals something true: our need to question, to challenge, to wonder. History is not just dates and rulers, it is a living conversation. The past may be written, but belief is always open. In that space between fact and imagination, phantom time endures, not as history, but as a timeless mystery.